My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and recently I've been rereading The Lord of the Rings, and I just finished the end of Book 3, which is the first half of the Two Towers, covering the events witnessed by Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, and Merry and Pippin, and of course Gandalf. And it ends with Pippin looking into the Palantir and Gandalf riding off with him, unlike in the movie where that comes in the Return of the King. So since this is fresh on my memory, I wanted to do kind of an analysis of the differences between the book and the movie as far as this scene goes. So let's get started. In the movie, of course, what we see is Gandalf and the other companions arrive at Isengard, talk to Saruman, who is on top of the Tower of Orthanc, and this really only happens in the extended edition, the conversation with Saruman. In the theatrical cut, it skips all of that and just moves to Pippin finds the Palantir in the water. The way it ends up in the water in the extended edition is Wormtongue ends up stabbing Saruman in the back. Legolas shoots Wormtongue. Saruman then falls, and the Palantir rolls out of his sleeve. So then Pippin picks it up. Gandalf takes it from Pippin. They make it back to Edoras to celebrate their victory, and Gandalf, while he is sleeping, Pippin and Merry are still awake. Pippin is really fidgety and gets up and starts moving towards Gandalf. Merry's like, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I just want to look at it one more time." And so he picks it up. He kind of backs off a bit because he sees Gandalf's eyes kind of half open, but he realizes that he's just asleep, but maybe in a REM state or something. Who knows? Anyway, Merry's telling him kind of quietly the whole time, "Stop what you're doing." But Pippin picks it up anyway, has this vision, starts going kind of crazy. Merry's still doing his thing, trying to tell him he's getting worried. And the next thing you know, somebody actually shouts. It's kind of hard to tell in the movie, but I think it's Merry. And then people start waking up. Gandalf takes control, covers up the Palantir, and then gets Pippin to recover, finds out what he did, and then we kind of we skip to a scene later on where he's explaining what Pippin saw and what happened. And apparently what Pippin saw in the movie is a white tree burning, and Gandalf takes this as a hint that what Sauron is planning next is to attack Minas Tirith, because the white tree, of course, is in the courtyard of Minas Tirith. And so then he rides off with Pippin and leaves the rest of them and heads towards Minas Tirith himself to warn them of the oncoming attack. So that's pretty much the summary of what happens in the movie, including the extended edition material. Now let's take a look at the actual book, which is very different, and it's going to take a little bit longer to explain because it's a little more nuanced than what happens in the movie as well. The differences from the book and the movie start almost immediately. Gandalf and the companions do go to Isengard. Gandalf goes with Legolas, Gimli, Aragorn, and Theoden up to, well, and also Éomer, up to the top of the stairs at the base of the Tower of Orthanc, and to talk to Saruman, who comes out onto a balcony, not at the very top of the tower, which makes more sense. There's really no way he'd be able to hear from the top of the tower, as tall as it is. But anyway, they're talking. Saruman does not die in this scene. He dies actually much later at the Scouring of the Shire, which I've done another video on, and I'll link to that in the description below so you can kind of get an idea of how that goes down if you're interested. But at the end of this conversation, Gandalf breaks Saruman's staff and basically commands him to go, and he just kind of seems like he's basically forced to kind of fall and crawl away. Shortly after that, a round object comes hurtling out of a higher window and hits the guardrail where Saruman had just been standing, and then plummets down to the bottom, hits the stairs, and goes to the bottom of the stairs where Merry and Pippin are waiting, and that's when Pippin grabs the Palantir. Now, Gandalf actually makes the remark, well, Éomer actually starts off by saying he just tried to kill you, and Gandalf said, actually, I think that was Wormtongue from higher up, and I don't think Saruman really would have wanted to throw that out. And they also make a remark about how it was badly aimed because it didn't actually hit anywhere near Gandalf. And somebody mentions, well, maybe it was badly aimed because he couldn't tell who he wanted to kill more, Gandalf or Saruman, because it was, it hit the guardrail right where Saruman was. Anyway, Pippin picks it up. Gandalf does come down and takes it from Pippin, and at that point, Pippin is, interested in it, but Gandalf has taken it. They all ride off and they camp before they reach the Fords of Isen because it's still a good long ride. And they make camp there, and Merry and Pippin are talking before they go to bed. Merry was with Gandalf, and Pippin's kind of complaining, I wish I could have been with Gandalf. I wanted more information, blah, blah, blah. Merry's like, well, you heard most of it anyway. And so in the course of the conversation, it finally kind of comes to light that what Pippin's really interested in is the Palantir. And Merry says, now, don't go meddling into the affairs of wizards, quoting an elf that they had run into much earlier in the story who also got cut out of the movie. And Pippin says, well, our entire lives lately have been meddling in the affairs of wizards. I just want more information. But anyway, Merry basically just tells him, look, go to sleep. You can ride with Gandalf tomorrow, and I'll ride with Aragorn, and you can get all the information you want. Well, Pippin, of course, does not go to sleep, and that's when we move into the actual looking into the Palantir. So let's talk about that, because it's a little more detailed than what the movie is. This next part of the course of events is actually pretty faithfully recreated in the movie, because in the book, Pippin does go up to Gandalf, sees apparently his eyes kind of half open, kind of goes back and realizes, well, he actually is asleep. And like in the movie where he kind of takes a pot to replace the Palantir with, here he takes the Palantir and grabs a stone. They're camping out in the field, so he doesn't have access to a jar or anything like that. But he grabs a stone to put back in Gandalf's elbow where he took the Palantir from, and then he starts looking at it. And at first, we really only get kind of the narrator's description of what you would have seen if you were watching Pippin. And throughout this whole thing, you're just getting Pippin's idea of what's going on and how he's really just drawn to it kind of half against his will. And that's really the first hint we get of one of the aspects of Palantirs that are kind of interesting, but will become a little clearer later on. But he's looking at it, and at first it's just dark, and he's kind of thinking about putting it away, but then something kind of starts to light up in the middle, and it says that now he's kind of stuck. He can't look away. And gradually he just becomes rigid, can't move, and the stone is doing more and more things. And the next thing you know, he actually gives kind of a strangled cry, which wakes everybody else up. And they start trying to figure out what the deal is. And Gandalf finds him and says, here's the thief. And of course, he's also really concerned about Pippin. So he starts trying to tend to Pippin and does some stuff to wake him up, because Pippin, again, much like in the movie, the book also has him basically just kind of staring blankly up at the sky, although in the movie, of course, it's at a ceiling, but still, he's blankly staring without any indication that he's really conscious. But Gandalf brings him back, and Pippin, basically says, forgive me, and Gandalf says, forgive you? Tell me first what you've done. And at first, Pippin is really, really hesitant to actually say what he saw. And it's not the same thing that he saw in the movie. What he sees in the book, at first he sees stars, and then he sees a tower with bat-like shapes flying around it. And based on his description, he says that he thinks they were actually quite big, but they only look like bats because of the distance. You get the idea that he's seeing flying Nazgul flying around the Tower of Barad-dûr. And after that, it seems like he kind of gets, with his vision towards the Tower of Barad-dûr, he then gets basically noticed by Sauron, who at first asks, why have you taken so long to report? Which seems kind of interesting. And then it's like he says, he notices Pippin for the first time and says, oh, well, who are you? And Pippin at first doesn't answer, and then Sauron does something that causes him some kind of pain or discomfort. Not really exactly clear how or why, but Pippin eventually answers a hobbit, and Sauron, he kind of gets a little bit of glee out of this. And Pippin, of course, is horrified. Sauron basically tells Saruman, well, I think he just says tell him, but the implication is Saruman, that this dainty is not for him. I'm going to send somebody to take it. Tell him just that. And then that's basically when Pippin finally, lets loose his cry, and that's kind of the last thing he sees. So at that point, Gandalf, kind of looks in his eyes and says, "Okay, I believe you. That's it." There was one other small point. Actually, the bat shapes flying around Barad-dûr. He said that one ended up flying towards him basically, and he said it had a horrible no, I can't say. Really interesting what it was he actually saw there. But that's just kind of a side note, not terribly important to the actual progression of events. So anyway, that's what happens in the actual scene where he sees things. So now let's talk about what happens afterward and get a little more explanation of what's going on here. Gandalf then, of course, kind of leaves Pippin in the company of Merry, takes the Palantir so he won't be tempted to look at it again, and he goes back to talk with Theoden and Aragorn and the rest, and basically says, well, we're pretty lucky here because Sauron didn't actually question Pippin on the spot, which would have been disastrous, but Sauron was probably in too much of a hurry. He assumed Pippin was in Orthanc because that's where the stone was housed. Why wouldn't he be in Orthanc? And of course, he probably already knew that Saruman was trying to, and may have already known that, his Uruk-hai had captured 2 hobbits. So he was probably just assuming that Saruman had Pippin in Orthanc and was having him look into the stone just as kind of a torture of Pippin. So they're discussing what they need to do, and while they're having that discussion, well, actually, before they finish the discussion, they kind of are discussing what the stone is, because up to that point they didn't really know, and Aragorn basically says, well, it's pretty clear now that this is the Palantir of Orthanc. And he mentions that in the context of Gandalf basically saying, I don't remember how he says it, but he gives the idea that, it's really not safe. And Aragorn says, well, there's one who could lay a rightful claim to it, the King of Gondor, and that's me. And Gandalf basically says, yeah, you're right. So if you'll take it, then here it is. But if I might counsel you in the use of your own, don't use it yet. And basically, he gives it to Aragorn. And then while they're having their discussion, they feel cold and fear, and something kind of blots out the stars. So again, we have a flying Nazgul. And so Gandalf, just kind of stands there at first rigid and says, and then he shouts Nazgul and basically says, don't anybody wait for the morning. We're all going to ride now. The swift shouldn't wait for the slow. Just go. Everybody get out of here. And so he takes Pippin, and basically to make sure that he doesn't have another opportunity to look at the stone, and they ride off. Merry and Aragorn start getting ready to do their own thing to ride to Helm's Deep and Edoras. So on the ride, Gandalf and Pippin actually have a conversation about the stone itself, and here we get a little bit more information. And this actually, I forgot to mention this earlier, when Gandalf was initially talking to Pippin, he basically said, if you get another itch in your hands, let me know. These things can be cured. And he also mentions that you should never have touched the stone, but I was too busy dealing with Saruman to think about it at the time. And you get the impression, this goes back to what we heard earlier about Pippin not really having a choice to look, or it was half against his will. You're getting more and more of the impression that the Palantir really is having an effect of its own on Pippin's mind, drawing him to it. What that is, we don't really ever get fully explained, but in the conversation that Gandalf has with Pippin, he again brings this up and says that even he felt the draw of it, and wanted to use it to look and see if he could wrest the stone from the control of Sauron and look back. And he says maybe even look back across time and space to Feanor doing his thing, creating the Silmarils or who knows what. And he even also mentions that the stones may have even been created by Feanor. He doesn't seem to know for sure who made them, And I've actually done a video on the Palantir based on the Unfinished Tales material, and I'll link to that in the description below as well to give a little bit more about their history. But he kind of mentions them. He also mentions a rhyme uh, that discusses the kings of Numenor who came uh, from the fall of Numenor, and part of the rhyme goes, "What did they bring across the Foundering Sea? 7 stars and 7 stones and 1 white tree." And the 7 stones, of course, are the Palantir. And he tells Pippin about a little bit of the history of the Palantir, about where they were originally stored. Says that many of them were lost, but that Sauron must have obtained one and used it, probably the Minas Ithil stone, which of course became Minas Morgul because that's the one part of Gondor that he actually captured himself, and used it, basically for his own purposes. And then Saruman, when he started using the Orthanc stone for his own ends, probably to look for the ring or who knows what, eventually looked toward Barad-dûr, and at that point Sauron ensnared Saruman, and that led, at least in part, to Saruman's fall. And Gandalf is basically just kind of piecing all this together as they ride, and basically like, can't believe Saruman did this. What an idiot. He was already, of course, at that point somewhat prideful, even according to Gandalf, but he didn't really completely become a total bad guy. At least you get the idea that Gandalf doesn't think he did until that happened. So he's piecing all this together and kind of telling Pippin while they're on their ride. And basically, that's the most information we get about the Palantir in the Lord of the Rings itself. Like I said, there's the Unfinished Tales material, which I've done a video on. But Gandalf also tells him about a few other things. They have some other discussion. But this pretty much wraps up the book version of what happens with Pippin and the Palantir. So I'll leave that there, and let's kind of talk about a little bit of the differences. So some of the more interesting differences are, of course, the fact that you don't have Merry watching Pippin do this. He knows that Pippin is interested, but he doesn't really expect him to go do that, and he's asleep when all this happens, which makes a lot more sense. In the movie, I'm always aggravated because I'm watching it and I'm like, why aren't you actually doing anything to intervene? It doesn't make any sense. In the book, it actually works because Pippin is the only one who knows what he's doing at the time. It's also interesting that we get this idea that Palantir have an effect on anybody who actually touches them that makes you want to, look into them. Is that something that's just native to the Palantir itself, or is that because Sauron has worked his influence on the Orthanc stone via his own Palantir, such that it has this effect now? It's not really made clear, but you kind of get the impression that it's just a natural thing of the stone itself, which is a bit odd because that's something you typically associate with, the ring or something evil, whereas the Palantir were not created as evil things. They were created by the Noldor, possibly Feanor himself, according to Gandalf, and they weren't ever really, they weren't for evil purposes. They were just for communication and seeing things far off. So it's really interesting to get that little piece of information. Does it have that draw just because it's a magical item and that's just the nature of magic? Hard to say, but it is an interesting thing to note. The other interesting thing, of course, is that you don't really get, in the movie, they all get back to Edoras before any of this happens, and when Pippin does his thing, and then they all wait for the next morning before Gandalf really tells anybody what happened. And what he sees is the White Tree of Gondor in flames in a courtyard, which in the movie is kind of the way of saying, well, this is why we need to go to Gondor. But in the book, everybody kind of already knows Gondor's, in trouble. And really in the movie you do too. Boromir at the Council of Elrond basically tells everybody, by the blood of our people are your lands kept safe. They're the ones fighting Sauron day in, day out because they're the ones next to him. So of course Gondor, and of course the other thing too is Gondor is the one kingdom of men that's still left that really has, a special place in Sauron's heart for animosity because he hates Numenor. So you don't need that that transition of this is why we need to go to Gondor. It's kind of obvious, really. And so that's another thing that's kind of always annoyed me a little bit about the way the movie handles it, is they act like we have to have this catalyst for why we go to Gondor when it should be kind of obvious. Um, but anyway, you also, of course, have the arrival of the Nazgul, which is what sends Gandalf off in a hurry with Pippin. And the Nazgul, he explains to Pippin, that wouldn't have been as a result of you looking into the stone, because it's Parador's way too far off. He couldn't have got here in time. There's some other reason why that Nazgul is here. But anyway, the fact that the Nazgul flew over, at that time, just is an interesting coincidence in timing, which almost seems like, some hand of fate being involved, because the fact that Gandalf has to ride off then basically immediately probably is helpful in the end. But anyway, that's another major difference. And then the other difference is we actually learn a bit about the Palantir due to Gandalf and Pippin having a conversation about it, which is interesting to the reader because the reader's finding out about these things for the first time and they don't really know anything about it. Whereas in the movie, of course, we had that scene where Saruman and Gandalf are talking in the Tower of Orthanc in the Fellowship of the Ring, and Saruman reveals that he has a Palantir. In the book, this never happens. Gandalf doesn't know that he has a Palantir, and all the Palantir are basically presumed lost. And so that's why nobody really thought that Saruman had it, and why he didn't know immediately when it came crashing down what it was. And so you get a little bit more of an interesting dynamic where Gandalf is having to piece together, the puzzle in his mind, and he's telling Pippin about what he's thinking, because he's kind of talking to himself, and Pippin's like, "What are you talking about?" And they start this conversation. So in the process, we learn what palantíri are, and also more about their history and what they do and that sort of thing. So it's a more interesting scene in the book in that sense. And of course, in the movie, because of the earlier scene, Gandalf knows immediately what it is, which he obviously doesn't in the book. And that's another interesting thing too. You've got the White Council, who everybody tends to think of as being super wise and all this stuff, but Gandalf basically admits to Pippin, we hadn't really taken thought about the Palantíri because they've been lost for centuries and they're barely even remembered now. Of course, it later turns out not only is the one in Orthanc surviving, and whichever one Sauron captured, Denethor also has a Palantir, which we'll get, that's a thing for another video, but it's just, it goes to show that even the very wise in Middle-earth have their blind spots. So those are some of the interesting differences, I think, that make the book worth knowing, the book version worth knowing, as opposed to the movie. So if you've never read the book, now you've got a little bit of a different view of how all this goes down. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you like the comparison of the book and movie versions of Pippin looking into the Palantir and how that plays out differently in the two different versions. If you did, please do give the video a like and share it around. If you want to specifically request an idea for a future video, you can do that in the comments below. And if you want to subscribe to the video, then you can do that here. And you can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, and you can check out a couple of my previous videos here. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.